Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Joan Esposito Show. My name is William Muck, and I'm filling in for Joan again today. Welcome back. As many of you know, I'm a political science professor out at North Central College in Naperville, Illinois, and I'm so grateful to be here with you today for a little post-Thanksgiving political chat. We've eaten all of the turkey, we've watched all of the football, and now it's time to talk some politics. And I'm guessing the Bear fans out there are ready to talk politics because there's no space for Bear talk anymore. So I do hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. And if you were able, enjoyed some time with friends and family. I hope those conversations around the dinner table were kind, full of empathy, and that we avoided flinging any turkey or stuffing at each other. So this can be a tense time. I will say I'm lucky to have a family where we all share a similar ideological view of politics and the world. And I know that's always, or even generally, the case. These can be hard conversations, especially after an election where we're coming together and feelings are very, very raw. So, but even in a family where everybody agrees on politics, I did say it was noticeable that there was an absence of desire for political conversations at our house. We all agree, but there just wasn't the same energy for it. And I think for many, it's hard for us to grapple with the reality that we're facing down a second Trump presidency. And while we may be grateful for many things, there is still pain in coming to terms with the country that decided it wanted a second helping, not of stuffing, not of turkey, but of Trumpism. And I think for many, that's a particularly bitter pill to swallow. And I will just say honestly, in my life, it's the women in my life, my daughter, my wife, my mother-in-law, my mother. It's hard to be enthusiastic about engaging a political system that seems to prefer even the most flawed of human beings over electing a woman. Many of the conversations that I've had, that's a point that keeps coming up over and over again. And I mentioned this on the show on Tuesday, but I sometimes wonder whether we're being tested by the democracy gods. It's funny, but I think a lot about this, right? The democracy gods came together and said, let's create the most flawed politician possible. Let's make him, and again, it's got to be a him, corrupt, immoral, criminal, a narcissist who cheats in every possible way. And then let's see whether the people will vote for him. And the answer is that we did. So I understand the desire to pull away from politics in this moment. I think we're seeing this at the macro level. Interest in cable news. There have been a number of articles out the last couple days talking about the decline in viewership for networks like MSNBC and CNN. My guess is that as time passes and as the inevitable assault on the democracy by the Trump administration proceeds, our interest and passions will return. I will say that's not something I struggle with. My passions are always there. But at a human level, I can understand the desire to pull away. But the reality is that we can't. This last Tuesday, we had Barbara McQuaid, this NBC News legal analyst. She's on MSNBC a lot as well. She'll be familiar to many of you. And in that conversation, she made a really compelling case for staying engaged. That at this moment, the democracy needs to flex its muscles. We need to be engaged. We need to fight disinformation. And I found that to be a really powerful lesson. So I am curious. I'm curious to know how yesterday went. A little bit later in the show, we'll open the phone lines up and we can talk about all variety of politics, but also what things were like around the Thanksgiving table. I want you to share those experiences with us. Before we do and dive into all the politics, let me give you a quick preview of our plan for the show today. For the first half an hour or so, I'm going to share some thoughts on Trump's proposed tariffs, as well as a few thoughts on what we should be looking for if we're worried about an attack on the democracy. And I think that's likely we're going to see some anti-democratic tactics. So what should we be looking for and how do we respond to those things? Then at 2:30, we're going to open the phone and text lines up for a full hour. Whatever is on your mind, Trump, Biden, the election, international politics, domestic politics. We'll talk talk through all of it. At 3:30, we're going to be joined by John Shaw, who is the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. He has written a book on presidential transition, specifically the presidential transition from Eisenhower to Kennedy. We're going to draw on his expertise about presidential transitions to better understand what we're seeing out of the Trump administration. And it's just really, really fascinating thinking about that transition from Eisenhower to Kennedy, two very, very different people, two very different political dynamics, and kind of thinking about those patterns and what parallels we see to today. So John is just a really, really super smart guy, and I think you're going to enjoy that a lot. Then for the final hour, we're going to be joined by a professor of political science, Phil Barker. He specializes in international politics, and I think what we need to do is think through what a second Trump presidency will mean for the international system. And we're going to discuss Russia and Putin's recent threats to use nuclear weapons. We'll talk about the Middle East and how this, how a Trump presidency might also impact China. But I think more at a broader level, thinking about what does it mean for America and American foreign policy to have a Trump administration where leadership and sort of this idea of a Pax Americana starts to go away. What does that mean for the rest of the world? We'll also talk a little bit about the recent arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu from the ICC and kind of talk through the logistics of what that all means. So we're going to hit on a lot of really, really important, engaging topics, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. But I want to begin. I want to begin with tariffs. So this is maybe the biggest news that's come out this week, but President-elect Donald Trump said on Monday that he would impose tariffs on all products coming into the United States from Canada, Mexico, and China on his first day in office. He announced this on Truth Social in a long post, and he talked about the tariff will remain in effect until such time as, and this is his quote, as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stop the invasion of our country. He wrote that both Mexico and Canada have absolute right and power to easily solve this long simmering problem. And then he said, we hereby demand that they use this power, and until such time as they do, it is time for them to pay a very big price. And then in another post right after that, he announced an additional 10% tariff on China and noted, and again, this is sometimes the language is really powerful here. He said, representatives of China told me that they would institute their maximum penalty, that of death, for any drug dealers caught doing this, but unfortunately, they have never followed through, unquote. Again, that's directly from Donald Trump. So let's for a moment ignore how historically odd it is to announce a policy this way. And let's also ignore the dehumanizing language that he uses. Let's just talk for a minute about the economic impact such a policy might have. These are the United States' three biggest trading partners. Our economies are deeply intertwined with each other. The tariffs would have a serious implication for American industries, including auto manufacturers, farmers, food packagers. You can't think about the number of industries which ship parts, materials, and finished goods across the U.S. border. The assumption is that, everything is made in the United States, and that's just not the nature of our world economy anymore. The New York Times wrote something this week noting that Mexico, China, and Canada together account for more than a third of the goods and services both imported and exported by the United States, supporting tens of millions of American jobs. This is sort of just bizarre thinking about this. And what made me laugh sort of about all this is that when he announced this plan, a scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, that video, it went viral on all the social media networks. As many of you likely remember, in the 1986 movie Ferris Bueller, he had a teacher played by the famous monotone Ben Stein, who recounts the impact of high tariffs on the U.S. economy after the Great Depression to a classroom of very zoned out students. In the scene, Bueller's economic teacher explains the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, a Republican law enacted in 1930 that raised tariffs on imported goods. Lady B, can we just play this clip? I think everyone will find this sort of funny.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the Great Depression, passed the tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which raised or lowered tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression.
All right, so I'm not an economist, but I do talk to economists all the time, and I do spend some time studying economic and political development. And that sort of, I was just sort of laughing as that thing is going viral. And we knew in 1986 that tariffs did not work. And if there's one thing economists see as deeply problematic for the U.S. economy, it's tariffs, especially in the current system we've developed. Our world economy is deeply intertwined with other countries around the world. And this is not an accident, right? Coming out of World War II, there was a realization that economic isolation can contribute to the incentive for war. And so tying the world's economies together could help decrease the incentive for war. I mean, so this was the thinking behind all of this. So, it's sort of interesting to see the way in which Trump is talking about tariffs as a good thing. But the reality is that these are going to have a dramatic impact on our economy. And that's not to say that capitalism is all good, right? We can have some very thoughtful conversations about the way in which capitalism is complicated. But if we look at what the world economy has done since World War II, part of that thinking of creating a globalized world system was to decrease the incentive for war. And when you start reintroducing tariffs, especially for your biggest trading partners, that increases the likelihood of states pulling away from each other and ultimately war. So we can come back and talk more about this later. We're up against the break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about democracy and what we need to be watching for as the democracy begins to transition to a Trump presidency. We'll be right back.
Driving it home with Patty Vasquez.
There's so much misinformation. The fact that there are people out there who truly believe that it's Biden's fault that we don't have access to abortion care in many states in this country is astounding to me. It's a lack of intellectual curiosity. I mean, you don't want to be better informed on issues. Just simply Googling, how did we lose Roe v. Wade, instead of walking around going, it's Biden's fault.
Patty Vasquez, weeknights 5 to 7 on WCPT 820.
WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. I'm William Muck, and we're diving into a whole bunch of political talk today. Just wanted to remind everybody that on Monday on Choose Views, Richard Chu will talk to Matt McNeil of the Matt McNeil Show, heard here weeknights at 9 o'clock. That's Choose Views, Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 a.m. on WCPT 820, the Heartland Signal. All right, so as we were talking, we talked a little bit about tariffs there. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is democracy. And the question of what type of threat to democracy does Donald Trump pose? Now, I will preface all of this by saying that I've spent the better part of the last 7 or 8 years of my life highlighting the nature of Donald Trump's threat to democracy. And in particular, over the last 2 years, doing everything I can in public talks and lectures and writing to make the nature of that threat crystal clear. This is one area where political science scholarship has a lot to offer. We understand who Donald Trump is and the type of threat that he poses, largely because we've seen so many of him before. And currently around the world, there are a lot of Donald Trumps. So there's a playbook for what they are doing. But despite my humble best efforts and the best efforts of a lot of political scientists around the country, Donald Trump, as we all know, was reelected again. So we find ourselves in a position where we need to think about what that potential Democratic decline or Democratic backsliding looks like. What should we be paying attention to? So I put together a list of things from the authoritarian playbook, as well as, what they do, as well as a few activities that can be done to counter these anti-democratic trends. And I think this is why we need to stay engaged, because there is going to be dramatic change being brought. And so the democracy needs to be able to respond to that. The first thing to know is that democracies die in a very different way now than they may have 40 or 50 years ago. It used to be the case that your democracy died when men with guns showed up to topple those democracies. Anti-democratic forces would use military forces to topple democracies. We can think about military coups, 70s and 80s. This is how democracies collapsed. That's not what we see today. Instead, today, democracies die from within. Anti-democratic forces use the tools of democracy to undermine democracy. And again, there's a lot of really interesting political science scholarship on this. Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat are some of the most well-known scholars writing about this, and I can't recommend their book, How Democracies Die, enough. It's very readable, so you don't have to be an academic or, studying democracy. This is just such a great book for understanding forces that are trying to undermine democracy, the tools and the tactics they do, and it puts Donald Trump in a broader context of these other authoritarians trying to use the tools of democracy to undermine democracy. And again, the idea that these authoritarian personalities get elected to office, they get elected to office, and then they use the tools of democracy to undermine democracy. So what does that look like? Well, I think, what we've seen in Hungary under Viktor Orban over the last few years, the prime minister of Hungary, is a really good example of the type of pressures we're likely to see over the next few years. Steve Bannon has called Orban Trump before Trump. And Vice President-elect J.D. Vance has cited Orban as an inspiration. So the fact that these guys are looking to Hungary and looking to Viktor Orban is a sort of realization that we should be seeing what happened in Hungary. And when we see those trends here, how do we respond to those? Again, we should take a deeper look. So what did Orban do to help bring about democratic decline in Hungary? Well, a couple of things. One, he embraced an anti-elite perspective. He pushed against the normative boundaries of the Hungarian political system. Orban knew to say, well, there are rules, but then there's long-standing unwritten norms. And when those are norms and not rules, that's how you push back. That's how you attack them, right? He also embraced an economic nationalism. Sort of a heavy mix of anti-immigrant and economic nationalism. So we've seen this out of Donald Trump. So this, again, should be very, very familiar. What did Orban do? He strengthened executive power. After serving one term, he returned the next time, and when he came back to power, he was much more attentive to finding ways to bring power into the executive office. To say we're not going to let that power reside in other parts of the democracy, other parts of the institution, whether it be the legislature or the judiciary. It was that you need to bring power centrally into the executive office. And I think this should make us think a lot about Project 2025. So the Trump administration and the incoming Trump administration has been very clear about the ways in which they would like to govern. They want a lot of power given to the president. And then as we think about some of the appointments that Donald Trump has announced, loyalty is the biggest thing. And why is that so important? Because you want loyalty. You don't want anybody pushing back. You don't want anybody in the cabinet who potentially could challenge the strength of the executive. So it's not just about putting your people there. It's having loyalists there who will allow you to center power in that presidency. So this is, again, part of the playbook. What else do we see? Discipline the judiciary. So you try to pull the Justice Department into your orbit. Same thing with the court system, and maybe the court system might be the most important one. If you are looking to drift your democracy in a more authoritarian direction, you look to control the courts. And this is what happened in Hungary, and it was very, very effective. You get your judges in there, you pull some of the power away from those judges that are against you, and then anything that you want to do legislatively or executively, it is simply rubber stamped by the Supreme Court. So this is why the courts in the United States matter so much. And I really fully realize that the courts tend to be conservative here, but one of the most important questions moving forward is, will the Supreme Court push back against Donald Trump? That is one of the most important questions. And I know our gut reaction is to say no, right? Because we're thinking about that immunity decision. But we don't know for sure, right? Donald Trump actually loses at the Supreme Court quite a lot. He's lost at the Supreme Court more than any other recent president. But what happens at that Supreme Court will be so, so important. The other things that we see people like Orban do, they change the electoral process. They try to control the media, and they try to secure control of their party. And I think we've seen that Donald Trump has absolutely done that with the Republican Party. He's attempted to control the electoral process. The one area that I think jumps out at us as so important is the media. And this is really interesting for us here as we think about this. Fighting for democracy, fighting for pluralism, media pluralism will be so important in these next few years. Because in countries that have backslid away from democracy, what has happened is those authoritarian figures have undermined the media. And so this means as we think about the role of the media in a Trump presidency, it needs to be active. There needs to be investigative journalism. But I think there also needs to be, news channels and media outlets that are getting their message across to non-metropolitan areas, right? So you need to think there's a lot of far-right news sources out there. Liberal-minded individuals, whether we're talking about billionaires or average people, need to think about how do you confront some of that right-wing media. Not necessarily because you just want to win the liberal cause, but because you want to continue to have a fully functioning democracy. Because that's one of the pieces. As we think about how you respond to the challenges of a Trump administration, having a judiciary, having a media that can push back and cover some of those things is going to be so important. And I think that's one really, really fascinating thing. If we look to Hungary, or we look to what happened in Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro, or if we look at what Vladimir Putin in Russia has done, he has tried to undermine the institutions in that democracy to centralize more power in the executive office. And I think that is very, very likely to happen in the Trump administration, whether we're talking about his cabinet, whether we're thinking about the power of the legislative branch. Will Republicans push back against Donald Trump? These are all such important questions, not just because we want to have an argument about partisanship and are liberals or conservative, are their ideas better, but as a way of preserving democratic practices. That's really, really important. And again, what we know is that authoritarian individuals, like Donald Trump, have a very, very clear playbook. They centralize power in the presidency. They try to target the court systems. They try to target the electoral system. And then they go after the media, right? This is really, really important as we start to think about how we move forward. So, all right. So I've put some big ideas out there that we can kick around and think about. So we are going to, Lady B, let's open the phone lines. And when we come back, we can have some conversation. So that number is 773-763-9278. 773-763-9278. Let's chat about anything that I've put out there, but anything in terms of, politics that you want to kick around. And we also have the text line open. So if you want to share some ideas via text, we can have a good conversation over the next hour. So again, that number is 773-763-9278. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you, and we'll be back in just a minute.
This is Chicago's Progressive Talk, 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and online at WCPT820.com, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll. Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We have just opened the call and text line, 773-763-9278. So if you've got something on your mind you want to chat about in terms of the world of politics, please share. Or if you just want to talk about how the Thanksgiving dinner was and how those conversations over stuffing and turkey were, I'd absolutely be happy to hear and have some conversation about what that's like. Also want to remind everybody that Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive, now has its very own podcast. Two, actually. Joan Esposito full episodes and Joan Esposito featured interviews. You can subscribe to one or both. The podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, YouTube, and Amazon. It's everywhere. Just searching for Joan Esposito, or get the links on Joan's show page by visiting theheartlandsignal.com and clicking on her picture. The full episode feed will include this show, and which is, so you can hear more. If you're not having enough now, you can come back and listen to it again. So a couple things, we were talking a bit about tariffs and the idea, the way in which these tariffs can impact economic development. And one of the things I talk about in my classes, so I teach a lot of courses on international politics, and we talk about the way in which the global economy has intertwined. And I oftentimes have my student read this piece by Thomas Friedman. It's a bit dated, but it talks about the Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention or conflict reduction. And Thomas Friedman, who many of you have probably seen from the New York Times and is, very active writer, but he talks about the way in which that when two countries have a McDonald's, they're much less likely to go to war with each other. And again, this was one of the big ideas coming out of World War II, that we needed to tie the world's economies together. And when we do so, that'll reduce the likelihood of conflict. So the idea is moving away from tariffs, moving away from barriers. Now, the Golden Arches theory of conflict reduction isn't perfect. There are, in fact, a handful of countries that have McDonald's, which have gone to war with each other. But I think the broader idea here is that the more economically intertwined the world's economies are, the less likely they are to go to war. And if we think about historic periods, when we've seen the world drift towards war, it's oftentimes when countries pull away from each other. I mean, we can think about, the whole idea of the European Union coming out of World War II was to tie the French and German economies together, to make those interdependent. And when we make them interdependent, it is much less likely that we're going to see France and Germany go to war with each other. Now, again, there are a lot of complexities to globalization. There are a lot of complexities to capitalism. But I do think that the way in which Donald Trump is approaching tariffs misses a lot of the really important dynamics of economic interdependence and decreasing the likelihood for war. And so, again, we are having a conversation as a country about, how do we want to engage the international system? How do we want to trade with each other? And we see criticisms of that political system, of capitalism, on the left and on the right, right? There's a general sense of frustration with that system. But again, the thought is, how do we want to move forward? And I think what Donald Trump is suggesting is that we just withdraw ourselves from that system, that we don't play, that we take our toys and go home. And I think it's important that we realize that there's a lot of danger to doing that. We are deeply intertwined with these other economies. So just something to think about there. As we think about how we adjust and address the pains of capitalism, sometimes that can be building the social safety net up, but it doesn't mean abandoning the capitalist market system. I mean, so there's a lot of conversation about the Nordic model. Whether we're talking about Sweden or Norway, or even, France and Germany for that extent, where they develop social safety nets that help those economies deal with the ups and downs of the global economy. So again, just to say that Donald Trump's understanding of tariffs seem like an oversimplification. So, all right, Lady B, I see we have a caller coming in, Mark from Illinois. He's worried about Trump and a possible civil war. Hey, Mark, how are you?
Hey. Yeah, so this just something that's been on my mind is what's to happen if, there is, in my mind, I thought the best case scenario is if, our government just realized he's overreaching, let's kind of just get this guy out of office because they're realizing he's, too dangerous for the U.S. But then he has so many devout followers who, obviously we've had January 6th, and that have shown us that they're capable of, going to violent extremes to try to keep him in office. And it just scares me that we might, end up fighting each other, going into civil war. So, I mean, am I, just being paranoid about that, or what are your thoughts on that?
No, this is a really, really important question. And so, within political science, there are a lot of people who specialize in civil war, and what you're hearing out of them is they share some of the same exact concerns that you have. And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? If you look around and you see the number of people who are willing to use violence to solve problems, that has gone up. If you look at the language that is used to describe each other, right? So we think about, and I think this is particularly the case for Donald Trump, you use demonizing language. You talk about the other, not just as your competitor, not just as somebody from the other party, but as the enemy, as evil, as no good, right? That is such an important transition. You're not just talking about somebody else who might beat you in this election and then in the future you have a chance to beat them. No, they pose an existential threat. Using language that, that the enemy is from within, that's a really, really important development here, where, it used to be that American enemies were external. The Soviet Union, capitalism, terrorism, those were the enemies. And now one thing that Trump has done is he's forced us to have a conversation about the enemy within. So what all this does is we think about the potential for a civil war. You can think about it as laying the kindling for fire. And then that language, the activities, the paramilitary groups, you put more and more of that kindling down. All it takes is a spark, and then suddenly you have much greater violence. So, that doesn't mean that the United States is going to have a civil war similar to, the main Civil War, but it is much more likely that we're going to see incidents like January 6th again, small groups attacking, small-scale violence. I think that's what we're likely to see. So this is, I think you're onto something. What makes you afraid that we may be drifting that direction?
Well, because January 6th has already happened, and like you said, he has used a lot of divisive words that, have incited violence, or words that don't condemn the violence from happening. So it's, emboldened a lot of people, and they don't feel like it's okay to, go through such violent extremes. And I feel like those that are, I guess, on his side probably have more tendency to go that route, because, they have the guns, they're those that are, I just feel like they're more capable of going into violence than those, progressive Democrats who probably want to go through more, peaceful ways of doing things.
Well, this is such an important point, right? And I think if we think about the history of political violence in the United States, what we've seen is over time, sometimes that violence is on the left and sometimes it's on the right. But where we're seeing that now is on the right? If you go back to the 70s, a lot of the violent and terror groups were on the left, right? There was violence coming from the extreme left, but now that violence is on the right. And Christopher Wray, Donald Trump's own FBI nominee, who may not be there once he comes back into office, he's talked about this, that, the real concern for the FBI internally right now within the United States is far-right extremism, individuals on the right using violence. And there's a lot of reasons for why they're drifting that direction, but some of it is the language of Donald Trump, the sense of anger and vengeance. And I think what we see is when the world goes through a lot of change, there are some groups who do not like that change. And they're willing to do whatever is necessary to prevent that change. And so when Donald Trump comes along and says, I will stop that change, I will push back against that type of change, he will pull some very, very powerful adherents to that. And again, your point is really, really important here in that Donald Trump does not dissuade the use of violence. He sort of plays off of that. I mean, you think all the way back to the Proud Boys and the comments that he made about the Proud Boys, stand back and stand ready, wherever those exact words were. I mean, they hear that in a way to say, this is a guy who I'm willing to fight for. And again, more and more of that kindling goes on to the potential fire. And then you see events like January 6th occurring. So now one hopes that doesn't happen. But when you look at scholars who study political violence, what they see is an environment that is very, very dangerous. And sometimes it's hard for us to see it in the system, right? We're looking at this. It's hard for us to judge this. But outsiders who are looking at the system say it looks really, really dangerous. And that if the United States doesn't, narrow the rhetoric, if it doesn't create economic opportunity for individuals, you're going to see more and more of this bubbling up.
Yeah, and I feel like other countries are just waiting, standing back and just waiting for us to, to self-destruct.
Well, this is all,
see it happening.
Absolutely. Especially, when you think about, especially a country like Russia and Vladimir Putin. So if we go all the way back to the 2016 presidential election, part of what Putin was doing, intervening in that election, was to create stress on our democracy. So, he intervened in ways that supported Donald Trump, but he also intervened in ways that supported Bernie Sanders, right? He intervened in both sides of all these issues because he was hoping to put stress on the democracy. He was hoping that we would turn against each other. And, standing back, I mean, Putin has to be thrilled with how well this worked out because he was effectively able to turn us against each other. And I mean, I think there's Russia, who's clearly a primary actor, but there's others, China and others, who are also benefiting from this. So, again, not to say that we're going to head toward this massive civil war, but I think the likelihood of political violence going up is absolutely more prominent now than it would have been 10 years ago.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate you taking my call.
I wish I had better news.
I try to feel a little bit more optimistic about it, but this is just the world we live in. I'm really hoping and praying for good decisions and from Congress, and that there is going to be some pushback and it not to leading to violence.
No, yes, and I don't want to be too dour about this as well, but I think it's important that we're honest with the circumstances we find ourselves in, and and the reality is that the likelihood of political violence has not decreased since January 6th. There's a political scientist at the University of Chicago named Robert Pape who studies this, and it's really easy. You can just sort of Google him and look at some of his data, and he looks at the incident of political violence, and part of what he does is he looks at who was involved in the January 6th attack. And we tend to think it was just individuals like the Proud Boys, sort of these extreme far-right paramilitary groups, but that's not all it was. A lot of the individuals who showed up in D.C. on January 6th and, stormed the Capitol were normal individuals, who had good incomes, owned businesses. And I think in some ways that's more problematic, that you had individuals who were benefiting from the system but still felt the need to exercise violence against that political system. That's really, really worrying. And again, you can tamp those things down, right? There are moments when violence increases and a political system can say, this is getting out of control. It's time to calm things down. I don't expect Donald Trump will do that, but it could happen, right? Republicans could do that. Democrats could do that. Our local politicians could turn away from some of that language. And I think that's what we have to hope for, is that there's a greater seriousness with which some of these politicians take their job.
Yeah. That's what I'm hoping for, too.
Well, thank you so much, Mark.
Right.
I really, it's not always the best thing to talk about with political violence, but I think it is important. So thanks so much for your call. I hope you had a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, too.
Absolutely. So we've got the phone lines open, 773-763-9278. We also have the text line open. So if you want to jump in and share some thoughts and some questions you might have about what's going on in the world of politics, whether it's Donald Trump, his cabinet, what's going on in the global economy, anything, we can chat about that. We're going to take a quick little break, and then when we come back, I see that Jim from Chicago is on the line. We can chat a little bit about religion. We'll be back in just a second.
WCPT Replay.
I am thrilled to be joined by Tom Nichols, staff writer at The Atlantic.
Illiberalism is a global movement right now of people using the levers of democracy to vote for people who are going to take away their democracy. It's basically like saying, I'm an American and I have rights, and I'm going to vote for the guy that's going to take away my rights because that will punish other people too. The illiberal movement is not the very poorest against the very richest. What you find with Trump voters, just as you did with illiberal voters in Italy and Poland and Turkey and other places, is that these are actually middle-class voters. Most of them are reasonably comfortable. If you look at the January 6th rioters, these were not unemployed factory workers. These were chiropractors and retired cops and real estate agents.
Keep listening to WCPT 820 because facts matter.
This is WCPT 820, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. I'm William Muck, and Lady B, as we went to that little, the comment, it was Tom Nichols talking about the same thing we were talking about. That was some perfect timing. I don't know if that was intentional or not. But Tom Nichols is a scholar who also studies political violence and was talking about much the same that I was hitting at, this danger of violence, and that oftentimes those engaging in violence, especially on January 6th, were not those that we think of as most extremism. They were just normal individuals who had been pushed to extremism. So, all right, we've got Jim from Chicago. Hey, Jim, how are you? Happy Thanksgiving.
Hi, I survived it. I was going to say that religion in our politics is quite a history. You've got I go back to the 60s, 70s, Vincent Peale. You see, the evangelists were always Republican. They wouldn't dare vote for a Democrat. But what's amazing about that to me is being a Democrat and being a Catholic, I've always voted for social justice and social reform and helping the poor, et cetera, et cetera. But this group seems to be dead on this. Even some of the Catholic stations jumped in for Trump. Like, if you didn't vote for Trump, you were committing a mortal sin. And to me, I find it amazing for the progression of the 60 years I've been alive. I don't understand how they can say that they're a religious party in the same place say, oh, I'm not letting any immigrants in here. Let them starve. I'm sure that Stephen Miller would leave the Holy Family outside of the wall on Christmas Eve and let them die in the elements. But yet they call themselves Christians. Can you explain that to me?
Sure. No, you're raising a really important point, Jim, especially as we think about the way in which religion is infused in our politics, right? And as you were talking, I was thinking back to the 90s when Bill Clinton was in office and the way in which, thinking about the focus on the family groups that were so critical of Bill Clinton and his indiscretions, right? That the whole critique of Bill Clinton at that time was that his behavior disqualified him for the office. Not any particular policies. It wasn't about politics. It was that he was an immoral person, and that was the center of that role right now. But if we think about the way in which religion and politics have fused today, it's very, very different. I often find myself thinking that, the groups that are, sort of the Christian nationalists and a lot of the religious groups that are engaging in politics, it is oftentimes more about the politics than it is about the religion. And certainly there's an intersection of the two. But as we think about the balance of that, a lot of these groups are much more politically motivated than they are religiously motivated, or in terms of at least that balance. And again, thinking about the way in which the separation of church and state, for a long time, it was just accepted doctrine that there was a fundamental separation of church and state. And now what we're seeing is a lot of the more religiously motivated political actors are pushing back against that, saying that's not the case, right? That, going back and the founding fathers believed that we should be a Christian nation. Now, again, I don't believe that. I don't think that's an accurate reading of the Constitution or what the founding fathers were arguing for. But you're right to say that we're seeing, Christian nationalism has a very different face now than it did during the 90s, when it really was focused about individual morality, and I think more housed in religion than it is in politics as it is today. What's your sense of that?
Well, I'm absolutely astounded how they can hijack a party, the religious evangelists, and even some of the Catholic stations, hijack the Republican Party and present it as a savior, a party that's the only. We should have one party, and that should be the evangelists and the extreme Catholics. And the Democrats, the Democratic Party, is a source of evil, which I find just the opposite. When I go into the voting booth, I vote for national health insurance. I vote for my fellow Americans. I want them to be free from. Citizens to be free and come back to Americans and make sure that everybody's free. I don't want to be under the yoke of some strange religion that they're proposing. I mean, look at our the guy running the House. He's got the 10 Commandments. Want to put the 10 Commandments in Texas, of all places, the 10 Commandments, where they're arresting people at the border and just abusing people relentlessly. And they want to put the 10 Commandments, and I find it so. It's just a religion that I don't. It's the antithesis to religion, as far as I'm concerned, and I don't know how long they can last on this.
I think about the difference. Think about the difference between Joe Biden, who's a Catholic, and a practicing Catholic, right? I mean, I saw something recently that Joe Biden has probably attended church more often as president than maybe any president in history. Like every Sunday, Joe was going to church, and that's clearly not the case for Donald Trump, right? He is. I don't want to speculate about somebody else's faith, but he doesn't strike you as a particularly religious guy. He's not somebody who you see going to church very often. He has been, when he's asked about what's his favorite part about the Bible, he'll say things like the whole Bible, all of it, right? He doesn't have a whole lot of knowledge, but nevertheless, there is something appealing to a lot of Catholics and Protestants in the United States. I mean, he connects. So then we have to ask the question, like, why is that the case? And I think part of the appeal is that Donald Trump, as flawed as he is seen as somebody who will defend religion, right? So there are a lot of Christians who feel like they are under attack, that the country is moving in a different direction, in a much more, anti-religious way. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think you're just seeing a pluralism of the political system, but they feel under attack. And they feel that the political system is targeting Christians. And you hear this quite often, where Christians feel like they are under attack, that they are the ones who are threatened. Now, the reality is, for much of the U.S. history, it has been Christian groups who've dominated that political system. White Christian groups in particular who have dominated that political system. And they certainly have lost some of that influence, but they still are dramatically influenced. But when that happens, those individuals feel threatened. And you are looking for somebody who will defend you. And I think Donald Trump, you can't find a more flawed vessel, but for many of them, he is the one who will fight for them. But your point is spot on, where he is so disconnected from their beliefs. It's a study in psychology why they would see him as a reflection of their faith. It's again, we are in a really, really unique political moment right now.
We sure are. Yeah. I don't know. It's in my existence, I've never seen anything like it. But I think that with his cabinet is so crazy. Everybody in that cabinet is so crazy that I think that the journalists and so on should pick on that, how crazy these people are. And what kills me is that they said he's not going to take any questions from the press. Well, he's never taken any questions from the press. He just does everything by fiat, right? He just announces it on his social media, and then the press picks it up and announces it to us. It's a ridiculous system, really, when you think about it. It's like King Henry VIII making a declaration, and then Cromwell coming out and telling us that here's what Henry said today. Okay, you know what I mean?
I love.
We're going back. We're going back centuries here. Anyway, thank you very much for taking my call.
Absolutely, and I love the historical religious reference. It's absolutely spot on. And one thing I would say, as we sort of circle back to the way in which the Trump administration, or an incoming Trump administration, threatens democracy, is the way in which this cabinet is going to go in front of the Senate Republicans. And the thing I am watching for is how much pushback do we get from Senate Republicans. We saw that on the issue of Matt Gaetz. They would not take Matt Gaetz, right? And I think they showed a little backbone, a little bit of spine. Now, I think that was easy to do because in any normal political universe, Matt Gaetz cannot be Attorney General, right? It just, when that first came out, I thought there's no way. It simply can't happen. There's other conversations to be had about those other nominees, but Matt Gaetz is a non-starter. And what we saw out of the Republicans in the Senate was actually a good thing, right? They behind the scenes and publicly pushed back against Matt Gaetz and said, no, this isn't going to happen. And that's a good sign, right? So as the beginning of the show, I was talking about, threats to democracy and these authoritarian tendencies that Donald Trump has. It's important that the Republican Party find moments to push back. There have been a lot of moments when they haven't, right? There's a lot of moments when they simply said, go ahead, Donald, right? I think about, the first and second impeachment. These were opportunities where the Republican Party could have removed an authoritarian threat. They had that opportunity and they chose not to. I'm seeing a little bit of positive when it comes to Matt Gaetz, that they push back. Now, the next question is, what happens with Pete Hegseth at the Department of Defense? Pete Hegseth strikes me as somebody who's particularly dangerous, both for not having the requisite experience of somebody who should be the head of the Department of Defense, but also as somebody who seems to have an ideological agenda. Pete Hegseth has said that, the military is too woke. There's too many DEI efforts, right? And he is going to go in and clean house. Well, I think those are positions that Senate Republicans should be concerned about, and that they need to push back. Tulsi Gabbard as DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, Senate Republicans, many of whom care deeply about national security, need to find a way to hold them accountable. Now, I think the sheer number of loyalists means that it's unlikely that all of them can be stopped. And at some point, the president does have the right to appoint his own cabinet. But I do hope that we see some backbone, some pushback, some democracy from Senate Republicans who say we are going going to have normal hearings. We are not going to allow recess appointments. If we see the Senate Republicans saying recess appointments are fine, or if they allow Donald Trump to circumvent the process, that's when our democracy bells and democracy alarms should be going off, because that's a big deal. So, all right, we are up against the break. We will come back in a little bit and talk more about the state of the U.S. democracy. See you then.
The Thom Hartmann radio program provides all of the intelligence, information, and insight you'll need to win the water cooler wars. Weekdays 11 to 2 right here on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk, where facts matter. You're listening to WCPT 820, because facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. I just want to remind everybody for listening live to the show, the Joan Esposito Show. You can listen weekdays from 2 to 5 p.m. at 8:20 a.m. on TuneIn from the heartlandsignal.com, or tell Alexa to play WCPT from TuneIn. We're really fancy here. All right, so I want us to get back, and we're going to go do some more callers. We've got Danny from Rockford who wants to talk about why people voted for Rock. Hey, Danny, Trump. How are you, Danny?
I'm doing very well. I just want to address the real issue here when it comes to Donald Trump in this United States of America in 2024. Nobody is talking about the real issue here. It has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with the fact that we've never seen a person like Donald Trump before, number one. We've never seen a person who has been established to be exactly what he is, and everybody knows what he is. But what people don't understand and don't want to have the conversation about in this country, this thing is about race. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a 75-year-old man who's been aware of race since I was 9 years old, and I watched it morph into what it's morphed it into. People don't understand that we have an element in this country, not all white folks, but a big portion of white folks. We've always had decent white people. If it wasn't for decent white people, we wouldn't be as far as we are to this day. But the sad part about it is that the hateful, racist white people outnumber the decent white people. And Donald Trump is a person that really brings all of this out. White people, in most, I'm going to say most white people, do not care for black people or Latino people or anybody but white people in this country. This is something we got to face. There's no explanation to this man winning this election under any other circumstances but the fact that white people understand who he is. He's a racist, and they know that he's a racist. And they know that this man, if it's any way possible, will keep black people out of their neighborhoods, keep them out of their schools, and keep them out of their restaurants and everywhere else that white and black people should be together on. But in this country, they don't want to have that race conversation. As far as the women, and you know how America really feels about women. It's just unjust and unfair how they always have treated women in this country. And there's no kinship. See, a lot of people thought that the white women were going to support the black women in this election and black and white women concerns. Okay? But there's never been a kinship in this country with white women and black women. You see what I'm saying?
Danny, you are. This is really, really thoughtful, and I'm glad. I mean, I'm glad you're saying this because it's a really important conversation to be had. The role that race and the role. I mean, it's to your latter point, the role that gender played in this election, and not just the election, but the broader political dynamics, right? So I tend to think about what are the circumstances that gave rise to Donald Trump. Some of that is a country that is changing. And what I mean by that is like demographic change, right? The country is becoming more diverse. We are having real conversations about race, efforts at, DEI, all of this, right? In the aftermath of George Floyd, the country tried to reckon with what was, with its history. And there are forces within the country that didn't want to have that conversation. And those individuals looked to somebody like Donald Trump to push back and say, we don't want that change. I always think about Make America Great Again. Part of that is going backwards. And the appeal of Donald Trump is he says, I'm not going to force you to have hard conversations about race. I'm not going to force you to have hard conversations about gender. I will pull you back to a time when you could live in ignorance and innocence of those conversations. But you're absolutely right, Danny, that we have to have those conversations if we're going to move forward and become a multiracial democracy, right? That's the ultimate goal, is the idea of moving towards a fully functioning multiracial democracy. Hasn't happened in history yet, but the United States is the one great experiment at that endeavor. I'm so glad you shared those thoughts. Other things you wanted to say?
Yes, if I can interject, that will never happen because there's an element here that don't want that to happen. Mm-hmm. See, the sad part about it is we've never had real integration in this country. I don't need integration myself. I'm a successful person in the things that I do. But I don't need integration. I have white friends, real white friends, a few of them, a handful of them. And most white people in this country do not want integration. We've never had integration because they know that once little black kids and Mexican kids and brown kids get together, all of those mythical lies will be gone because these young kids will see that the young black kid or the young Mexican kid is no different than he is. Mm-hmm. But if he keeps listening to grandpa and these white males who are actually perpetrating this division, they will see themselves and then we won't have this division.
Yes. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking about other moments in U.S. history where we've had similar dynamics. And, I probably have the Civil War in my mind because a previous caller mentioned that. But think about that era after the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, where blacks were given legitimate and growing democratic rights. There was real hope for progress there. And then what happened? Yeah, you have a backlash.
I have to intervene. We've never been given parity in this country. It's never happened. It appeared when they came up with different laws, it appeared that was the issue. But in reality, it wasn't the issue because when they came up with the Equal Opportunity Act for black people to work in certain jobs and do things like this, they still had a steel wall up for us. They always make things appear like they were going to live out the Constitution. The Constitution, when it was written, black people weren't even involved in it. Right. So you go back, and then religion. I'm writing a book right now about religion. I'm writing a book that would probably shock you if I told you to talk. You think you're ready for the title of my book?
Sure.
The name of my book is Jesus Christ has nothing to do with Christianity.
Interesting. Yes. Oh, go ahead.
And it's from serious African study to show us that the European, when they came up with Christianity, this was something to put them to an advantage. Constantine, when they just came up, and emperors came up with Christianity in about 325 B.C. Yeah. Africa had already been dealing with Christianity and not in this form over 7,000 years ago. That's where it all started.
Sure.
But what I'm saying is Christianity. People wonder why evangelicals supported this monster that we have as a president. I'm sorry to say that, but how can an evangelical, a person who is following Jesus Christ, support a man like this? But what Christians don't understand, that religion and spirituality are totally two different entities. Jesus Christ deals in spirituality, not man.
No, I think, Danny, you are making... This intersection. Oh, go ahead.
Let me tell you the cover of my book. Sure. I just told you what my book is going to be about. It's going to be a hard copy. What's going to be on the cover of my book is going to be a picture of the Vatican, and it's going to have Jesus Christ running away from it with an afro.
Danny, I get the sense that you don't mind pushing buttons here or there. I'm up against the break, so we got to wrap up. But just a couple thoughts on what you said. I think your point about parity is really, really important. It's never that we've seen the black community have parity with the white community. But what I think is really interesting is even in those moments when there was progress made, there is still the backlash, right? And so we think about the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, even baby steps precipitated a pushback. And I think that's part of what we see today is the country is changing. They're, changing in a variety of ways, demographic change, political change, globalization, all of this change. And part of the appeal of Donald Trump is that he says, enough is enough. I'm not going to force you to grapple with that change. And absolutely, right? He's playing off racial elements. He's playing off gender, religion, right? You think all those things sprinkled together help us understand what's going on here. Danny, I really appreciate the call. We got to go to break, but thank you so much for sharing. And good luck with your book, man. I get the sense that you're gonna stir it up, and I think that's important that we stir things up. So thank you so much.
Can I say one quick thing?
Sure, real quick, yeah.
One quick thing is my book won't be denigrating anybody. What my book is going to have is information, which is the most important thing that we need that we aren't getting. It's not forcing anybody to do anything. It's giving them information to be able to delineate the bull from the real thing. And this is what this is going to do. And it's going to be all documented information. They can go back and look in history, which we don't really do anymore because we're scared of African history where it all started. And that's what we need to do. And that's all I have to say today. I'll call you back again sometime.
Thank you so much for joining, Danny. I appreciate your perspective. All right, we're going to go to a break, and we'll be back with a couple more callers after this.
The Hal Sparks Radio Program.
I have been struggling to find a way to use AI in my life at all because I'm a creative person. I don't need it to be creative on my behalf. I understand why marketing people are like, write me some sort of dumb copy for this terrible product I don't need.
Every time I see an AI option, it's like, oh, click this AI. It'll make it longer. And I'm like, just put a bunch of word vomit in there. I can do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Hal Sparks, Saturdays from 11 to 1 on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk. Alexa, play WCPT.
WCPT from TuneIn.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We're having some really great conversation. Danny really stirred it up there. That was fun. I love that, Lady B. We have somebody who kind of hits us from a different perspective. So just want to remind everybody about the Heartland Signal. And if you haven't already, you can follow the Heartland Signal on X, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Threads at Heartland Signal, one word. And be sure to check heartlandsignal.com for daily updates. Really, really important there. All right. We just had a texter who sent in a message asking what my perspective on the restrictions being imposed on broadcast media under the new federal administration. Here's what I would say. To be honest, I don't really know what these new restrictions are going to look like. That's sort of a little bit out of my purview and my expertise, but something I'm curious about. And you're asking the right question, because as we start thinking about what comes next under a Trump administration, we have to be thinking about, in what ways is the federal government regulating the media, and is there a partisan angle to that? And I worry, maybe my biggest worry about Donald Trump is how is he going to approach the media. And he's threatened to, pull licenses. That would also set off my democracy alarm bell. So, all right, I want to go to Cynthia. And is she calling from Denver, Colorado? Cynthia, I used to live in Denver for 6 years. It was one of my favorite places. Welcome to WCPT.
Hi. Well, thank you for hosting. And yes, I'm a native of Colorado. So
wonderful.
Yeah, I just wanted to pretty much agree with Danny. I thought his call was really succinct and chock full of facts. I am a black woman, and I think the thing that hurt me the most was that Kamala had so many professional skills and accolades throughout her career. I feel like the MAGA generation, or this whole Trump thing, made a mockery. They make a mockery of science, education, and they did the same thing with Hillary. You know, it was the same.
Yeah.
You know, how could you be beat with someone who's so obnoxious? You know, so I really feel bad for the country. You know, in addition to the racism and the misogyny, they're going to be in for a world of hurt. You know, unnecessarily. Yes. You know, and I think in the future, moving forward, since information is only given in certain areas of the country, we must rely more on video. I would have loved to have seen Kamala share videos of what Trump has said and then debate that and educate the public on what her policy would be when he says this, or what her policy would be when he said that, or reference, you know, what he said and what happened in the past, you know, because it's all about educating folks. We're not all educated about day-to-day issues or challenges, and for sure a government history. You know, when the 2025 kicks in, Biden's policies are really going to blossom, and they're going to think Trump did it again. Well, and that's really idiotic, because government doesn't move fast.
No.
You know, being at the driver's license places should have tell people that. You know, so if they don't teach civics anymore, and haven't for 30 years in schools, government civics. I think if people would have had some information on how things work and whose terms benefit from what president, you know, plus or minus, there'd be a better understanding that mixed in with the racism and the misogyny, you know. And to me, they just didn't connect.
No,
you know?
I think that's right. And you're making a really powerful point here, right? I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking back to the presidential debate between Harris and Trump. And, you know, as I had a lot of international students that we were on campus watching it together, and to see their reaction was like, how is this even close, right? How is, you know, she is so qualified, so detailed. I mean, you just, by every measure, a better candidate, right? Even if you set aside the policy issues, just somebody who's thoughtful, deliberate, well prepared, right? And a lot of my international students were saying that we're not sure how this is even close. And it's what's made conversations, like even with my daughter after the election, so heartbreaking, because they get it. They get the same thing that you're saying, that this was not close. There was one qualified candidate, and there was somebody else who should never be near the levers of power, and the country picked that person. And again, we can't deny the role of race and gender in that decision. It's uncomfortable, but we have to grapple with it. And yeah, again, it's just heartbreaking that we're in this place right now where we have to try to get better. And to your point about civic education, I think that's the first step. You know, we start having these conversations and we try to educate our public. And I mean, that was the other thing. The diploma divide in the voting is just so stark. If you had a college degree, if you followed the news, you were much more likely to vote for Harris. If you had lower levels of education, and I think more importantly, we're not paying attention to the news, you were much more likely to vote for Donald Trump. And that says something, you know, again, which isn't to say that everybody needs to spend every minute listening to AM radio and talking politics, but we should have a democracy where people are engaged and have some knowledge about that system and make informed choices. And this election, it felt like we were just in some bizarro world where that wasn't happening.
Right. And I also believe that, you know, since there's no education about civics, government civics, and whatever, the Democrats might want to, you know, think about re-educating every time they talk, you know, and connect the dots for folks, because there were a lot of dots that weren't connected if you weren't paying attention. And, you know, unfortunately, there's more uneducated folks than there are educated. And, you know, that could be education-wise and streetwise, you know.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and you got to be able to connect those dots for folks, and especially if they're in a hurry, you know, working 2 and 3 jobs. I mean, I'm old enough to remember where you only needed one job, you know, to work and then an extra job to go on vacation, if you wanted to have vacation money,
Yeah.
So anyway, you're doing a good job. Thank you so much for allowing me to share. Hope you had a blessed holiday, and buckle up. We'll see what happens.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I just, as you were talking, you made me the importance of connecting, and I was thinking about politicians who've been good at that. Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, they were very good at connecting the dots for people and making them feel connected and welcomed. And I do think, there are times where the Democratic Party, and I'm probably as guilty as anybody, can be a bit disconnected. Maybe, I don't know if elitist is the right word, but it is really about connecting with people at multiple different levels. And some Democratic politicians are better at that. And I think this is a moment where that skill set could be really, really valuable. All right, we're kind of running out of time here. Let's go to Brian in Romeoville. Hey, Brian, welcome to the show.
The good professor, yes. I had a list here, but I would rather reinforce the last caller.
Sure.
Now, unfortunately, I had civics in school. Most of my classmates didn't care. They just, it was something they had, a class they had to take, they had to be there, they had to pass the test for the U.S. Constitution. My parents chased local politics here in Romeoville, and it was like having a full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
Just keeping after everybody, keeping them honest. And you're right, most of us don't have that kind of time, nor do we have the inclination. I remember my dad ran for village board, and he and his party lost, even though the mayor wasn't incumbent. And all I can tell you is about 6 months later, people would meet my parents in the grocery store and around town, and the big refrain was, you know what, we should have voted for your party.
Mm-hmm. Well, no, I think that's important. And again, separate from any sort of partisan or policy views, the idea is that you want to elevate the political discourse. You want to create a democracy where you can have some really good questions and debate, the role of government. Should we have big government or small government? But you have to have an electorate. You have to have a demos, right? You have to have the people who can engage in that, and you've got to give them the skills to do so. And it does feel to me that now we've drifted away from that, and we sort of celebrate ignorance. Donald Trump celebrates not knowing things. He celebrates being disconnected from reality, making up his own reality, and that's not healthy, and it's not good for democracy. We got like a minute left, Brian. What else did you want to share?
Well, let's take that just a little farther. That just on the news item, there are strikes in Italy. People are taking to the streets to protest cost of living and so forth. When the French do it, they do it a lot more often than the U.S. does. We mock them. We laugh at them. When the women struck and they wore those famous hats, how many of us laughed at that?
Mm-hmm.
And that is the way. Nonviolent. King was right. That's the way. And we have to get people to understand that it is not something to be mocked.
This is a good point, and thank you so much. That's a nice point to wrap up on, Brian. We've got to jump to a break. Thank you so much for the call. When we come back, we're going to be talking with John Shaw, who is the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University, and we're going to be talking about presidential transitions. So we'll be right back after a minute.
This is Chicago's Progressive Talk, 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and online at WCPT820.com, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. For our next segment, we are absolutely thrilled to be joined by John Shaw, who is the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Previously, John worked as a reporter in Washington, D.C. for more than 25 years, covering Congress for the Market News International, a global financial wire service, and the diplomatic community for the Washington Diplomat, a monthly magazine. He is the author of 5 books, including one that we're going to be talking about today, titled Rising Star, Setting Sun, Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and the Presidential Transition That Changed America. Welcome, John. Thank you so much for joining us on WCPT.
Thank you, Bill. It's my pleasure.
So I'm really excited to get your thoughts on the Trump presidential transition, largely because you've devoted a lot of your time in life to thinking about presidential transitions, and there aren't a whole lot of people who can say that. So, and in particular, a transition that you argue, so we go back in history a little bit, had a profound impact on the United States, and that's the transition from Eisenhower to Kennedy. History can be so valuable in understanding the present moment, so I think I'd like to start there. Can you tell us a little bit about why you see that particular presidential transition from Eisenhower to Kennedy as such a historic transition?
Well, it really did represent a kind of turning of the page, the ending of one era and the beginning of a next. With it, in some sense, it ended the 1950s and began the 1960s. So it's just an important historical pivot point. It's really fascinating, but it's also especially intriguing by just the two characters, the two principals, President Eisenhower and President-elect Kennedy. And Bill, I think you could argue that William Shakespeare could have appreciated Eisenhower and Kennedy in the sense that they were just two almost stock characters. I mean, you had Eisenhower as the aging general, had been president for 8 years, the man who defeated Hitler, this venerated old world figure in some sense, giving away reluctantly to a kind of a crown prince in JFK, someone who was the age of his son, someone who had been in Congress for 14 years, but Eisenhower did not see him as a major player or as a man who had the kind of stature that should inhabit the White House. But what's interesting is, so you had a new era coming into play. You had these two remarkable figures, as dissimilar as you could hope for. But they also, I think, were animated by this sense of the public interest. And I know that phrase seems somewhat archaic now, but, Eisenhower did not love Kennedy. He was deeply skeptical of him and was not pleased by the fact that Kennedy had run for president, basically by repudiating the Eisenhower presidency as represented by Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon. So Eisenhower began this process deeply skeptical of Kennedy. Kennedy ultimately won him over with some careful preparation and deference and so forth. But I guess the broader point was that they approached this as rivals, but not as enemies. That was maybe a different era in which political opponents, were not seen as just, someone possessing a fundamentally different view of the universe. So the two conducted the transition with real professionalism, I think.
That's really interesting to think. I teach a class where we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and one of the things I play for my students is that historic phone call where Kennedy reaches out to Eisenhower to ask him his thoughts on this. And as you were talking, it struck me that way, that they maybe had slightly different views, and Eisenhower during the Cuban Missile Crisis was maybe a bit more hawkish than Kennedy was ready to be. But there was a sense of respect. So you talk about it as a rivalry, but as maybe different than how we understand politics as the enemies today.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, but it's interesting. I think an earlier crisis is also illuminating the Bay of Pigs because, without going into a deep dive on the Bay of Pigs, that was a debacle. Kennedy inherited the framework of a plan, the concept of a plan, we might say, from Eisenhower, but changed it substantially and in a way that probably led to its, complete failure. Kennedy tried to kind of bring Eisenhower in to sort of absorb the blow. And Eisenhower was pretty cagey. I mean, he just, basically said, when I did invasions, they didn't fail. But again, it was done under the auspices of respect and sort of veiled language. But yeah, I think that too, this was maybe a different era in which, even though the politics were pretty fierce, I mean, the McCarthy era was pretty darn hard-nosed. Still, there was kind of an element of civility, particularly among the more centrist members of the political class who had different perspectives, but also viewed themselves as basically united in the commitment to challenge the Soviet Union and not to let, global communism prevail. So there was this sort of, a respect and sort of at least a broad shared agenda, which seems like it's been dissipated, certainly in the last couple years.
No, that's right, especially as we think about foreign policy. This idea that politics stops at the water's edge has sort of gone away. Now, you in the book, you argue that the transition was not just a change in leadership, but you talk about it as a turning point that defined the course of the Cold War, the civil rights movement, the nation's post-war trajectory. Can you explain to our listeners a little bit what you meant by that? Because I found that really fascinating. Think about this is an entirely new direction for the country.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think, at the same time, it was, it was a generational change, and that was the most striking thing. And it was just, and the imagery was stark. And if you look at some of the footage of the inauguration, for example, you see Eisenhower kind of huddled off on the side with a heavy jacket, kind of shivering in the cold. Kennedy famously threw off his jacket and gave an inaugural speech that is still quoted by many today. So there was, certainly a symbolic change of the guard. But I think there was also, I do think that the 1960s really began with this transition. And of course, we don't know how it might have unfolded differently had Kennedy lived, had Kennedy served a second term. There's all sorts of things that might have been different. But, the 1960s were one of the most turbulent decades in American history. And I think they were sort of launched on that January day in 1961 when Kennedy stepped to the podium and gave his speech. And then Eisenhower left quietly and returned to Gettysburg in his retirement.
Oh, so fascinating, kind of thinking about those presidential transitions. I'm curious, as a political scientist, I'm looking for patterns. And as a historian, as you're looking at the current presidential transition, right, thinking about the Trump transition team, are you seeing parallels or patterns? Like, what strikes you as you sort of think about these two different moments in history? Do you see the turning point today as similar to that mark from Eisenhower to JFK, or how are you viewing all of this?
Well, I think it's quite a bit different in the sense that Trump is a singular figure in American history, in the sense that he has, and maybe this, I'll state it sharply, and maybe it's a little bit too sharp, but Trump does not have respect for the traditions and norms of what has happened before. I've seen no evidence that he's particularly curious about American history, no evidence that he's read any American history, no evidence that he holds, his predecessors with any particular respect. So for Trump, the rules of the past, the traditions, the norms have been discarded. And it's a very, very different process watching Trump assemble his team and his cabinet. He seems scornful of all that's happened before. There does not seem to be a coherent ideological agenda. And the choices seem to be largely, folks that he's comfortable with, that he thinks will be loyal to him, and who in some way represent a repudiation of the establishment. Whereas I think Kennedy, I was thinking about just the way he assembled his team. Let me just even broaden it out a little bit, because I think it is interesting when I was thinking about just Kennedy and the administration he assembled. And it's interesting. Kennedy spent 4 years running for president, and it was 4 exhausting, grueling years. And I think he thought about governance in the policy sense, but less in the kind of personnel sense, where I think Trump is completely reversed. It's all personnel, very little policy. But with Kennedy, it was more like, he had assembled a policy agenda and then was looking for people who would implement that agenda. But even as much as respect as I have for Kennedy on many fronts, when I'm thinking about just how he assembled his cabinet, he was very focused on kind of the establishment of the Democratic Party and making sure that, there was balance between regions and governors and senators and, just kind of a overall balance. But there were parts of Kennedy's transition that are a little bit hard to explain. He barely knew his Secretary of State. I think he had met him once or twice before selecting him. Barely knew his Secretary of Defense. Had only met him a couple times before selecting him, Bob McNamara. And then, his selection of the Attorney General, his brother Robert, who was all of 35 or 36, was a lawyer, but had not really practiced law in any major sense. So, clearly Bobby Kennedy was brought in to be a loyalist. So I think Kennedy approached his presidency in a more disciplined and systematic way. But there were aspects of his cabinet selection process that, are a little bit hard to understand, except in the context of he had spent 4 years running for president and was less focused on the kind of the personnel aspect of staffing and administration.
That's really interesting. I love getting in the weeds and all of this. And as you were talking about Bob McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, and I was thinking about Kennedy. Kennedy wasn't afraid of big personalities, and I'm thinking about parallels or ways in which the Trump administration is dissimilar. And Trump seems to be going for loyalty and nobody who's going to challenge him, whereas Kennedy did have some big personalities and people who had accomplished things. That's right. Do you think that's a fair comparison in terms of how the two see the roles of their cabinet differently?
Oh, yeah, I think that's an important point. Kennedy was such a different figure, too, because there was this kind of quiet confidence to Kennedy, a kind of quiet swagger to him. And he had this sort of ability to be really self-confident without being cocky. He had this kind of sense. But I think the other thing that's really striking to think about, and I thought of this a lot, is when you look at the language of Kennedy's speeches, he almost never used the word I. He would say my administration, we, us, our. He almost never made a personal reference. It's very striking if you watch some of his press conferences. And Trump is the complete inverse. Just everything is everything is self-referential. And everything is, sort of a referendum on his manhood and his toughness and so forth. So I think at core, Kennedy had a kind of quiet confidence. He was very confident of his intelligence, his ability to understand issues, to see around the corner. And so he didn't feel a need to do this sort of public, posturing of Trump. And let me just say, the one moment from Trump's first term that stays with me, and it's striking, is that I forget, it was a NATO event or an event with European leaders in which there was a group milling around and they're being shepherded to either a photo op or something, and they're walking, and there was a gentleman who was half a step ahead of Trump. It was a European leader, and Trump just reaches over and pushes him aside and walks in front of him. And it was a behavior that most parents of 15-year-olds would be appalled if they saw their kid do that. And to think, the president of the United States, resorts to that kind of, sort of adolescent shoving. And when I saw that, I was thinking, JFK would not have done that. Dwight Eisenhower would not have done that. Yeah. Ronald Reagan would not have done that. Jimmy Carter would not have done that. George H.W. Bush would not have done it. And again, I don't mean to get into a lot of psychobabble here, but it struck me as fundamentally the behavior of sort of an insecure person who needed to prove that he was tough.
This is a really, really interesting comparison. We need to take a quick break here, but we will be right back with John Shaw to talk more about presidential transitions.
WCPT replay.
You recall the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, warned repeatedly over the last 3 decades that if we hit 1.5 degrees Celsius, the weather's going to go nuts and it's going to start killing people. And that's what we're seeing right now. And it looks like 2024 not only is going to be the warmest year in history, but it's going to be the first year that the planet was consistently above 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. And Trump's response to that is he continues to argue and continues to put people in his administration who say that climate change is a hoax. Keep in mind, the billionaires who've helped fund Donald Trump, many of them make their money by poisoning our planet.
Keep listening to WCPT 820 because facts matter.
Chicago's Progressive Talk, WCPT 820, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
We are back. Welcome to WCPT and the Joan Esposito Show. We are talking with John Shaw, who is at the Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University, the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. And we are discussing presidential transitions, thinking about the Eisenhower to Kennedy transition, but more broadly, reflecting on what's going on in the Trump transition. And so maybe this is we can return to that conversation. And you were talking about the unconventional nature of the Trump transition. Is there anything in particular that strikes you about what you've seen out of the first couple weeks of this Trump transition that stands out as unique or unconventional from other historical moments?
Well, I mean, almost everything. It just feels that, the selection of Gates, for example, someone who, is under no real, very few people would view him of having the stature and the kind of character to be the country's attorney general. And it just struck me as kind of an act of just utter defiance, a complete signal that I don't care what the rest of you think is valuable. This is someone who's been loyal to me, and that's the most important thing. I think just even the logistics, as I understand it, it was done kind of randomly on a flight from Florida to Washington or Washington to Florida, one of the two, where he just sort of impulsively goes in that direction. So I think the impulsiveness, the kind of the sort of just almost blatant and intentional disregard for the norms, for the institutions, for the departments that are being led. I mean, just the notion, I don't mean to be too trite here, but Linda McMahon, a former executive of professional wrestling leading the Department of Education. I mean, what better way to send a message of just complete scorn than that. So, and then just reading about just the selection of various people and the kind of palace intrigue and, locking doors and shutting people out of meetings and trying to get Trump's ear to put forward names. I mean, just the level of chaos and disorganization, is not surprising if you are alive and paying attention to the first term of the Trump presidency. I mean, it's the same routine. I guess the other point I would make is, for these people who are scrambling for cabinet positions, don't they remember what happened to Jeff Sessions? This guy, yes, was a Trump loyalist, the first senator to support Trump, went out on the limb, gave up a Senate seat, and was summarily humiliated and fired via, Twitter. Rex Tillerson, had this story, a celebrated career as a business executive, comes in and within a very short time is marginalized and fired. I mean, the list goes on. And I just don't know what it is about being part of a Trump administration that would be very compelling. I mean, Mike Pence, famously, Trump effectively encouraging people to kill him. And that's not overstating it on January 6th. No. So I don't know. For those who are scrambling for, a cabinet seat, I mean, good luck. I hope your resume is fresh because your shelf life may not be long, and your success is going to have nothing to do with the substance of your job, but it's going to have a lot to do with just how President Trump views you.
No, this is such an important point, right? The allure of power, it seems to transcend everything. And people are, want to be close to power and will compromise all sorts of integrity to get there. And the other thing I was thinking as you were talking about the importance of norms, and we do spend a lot of time thinking about Trump and the way in which he violates norms, but those transitional norms. And, whether we're talking about Eisenhower to Kennedy, or I was thinking about George H.W. Bush to Bill Clinton, who in many ways saw the world in very dissimilar ways. And that was a rough campaign, but that transition was much smoother. Or thinking about George W. Bush to Obama, like all of those transitions, there was a recognition of the historic role of the presidency and sort of a common bond between those two individuals, and we seem to have jettisoned those norms when it comes to a Trump transition, which I think there's a real loss to that.
Yeah, and I mean, the one aspect of these last 4 years or so that I don't think it can be overstated, and it's going to sound cliche, but just the peaceful transition to power, and the fact that Trump has made it very, very clear in 2020 and even this election when the outcome was uncertain. In his view, the only election results that were legitimate were ones that showed him as winner. If the same election, if he would have lost, he would have said it's rigged, it's unfair, and so forth. And so I think the shattering of the norm of a peaceful transition of power in 2020, I think historians will look at that as a really significant event in American history because, you mentioned some of the transitions. Let's not forget Al Gore and, George, W. Bush, yes, in which, Gore won the popular vote and, may have won Florida, except the Supreme Court stopped the vote, and he lost by 537 votes. And so, the Clinton administration didn't do anything to play games. Gore presided over the vote that confirmed Bush's election. So many of these norms that have been, so sacred to our survival as democracy and, norms that we haven't always appreciated, they were shattered in 2020. And we just don't know how, what other norms Donald Trump is prepared to shatter in the next 4 years.
That's such an important point, the rewriting of norms, both domestically and internationally, so I can't pass up an opportunity to think a little bit about international politics and to reference another one of your books, because I think it's also helpful for thinking through this unique historical moment. And your other book titled The Ambassador Inside the Life of a Working Diplomat, you offer this wonderfully behind-the-scenes look at one of the world's most accomplished diplomats, Sweden's Joan Eliasson. And in doing so, you give us a front-row seat at how diplomacy shapes world politics. And I've been thinking about that book as well as we think about a Donald Trump entering the office and the way in which he's going to change the international system. So maybe could you tell our listeners a little bit about what you're looking at in that book and then how it may connect to the world we're thinking about now where Donald Trump is looking to shatter many of those diplomatic norms?
Yeah, Ambassador Eliasson is one of the world's most skilled diplomats. He represented Sweden for 5 years in as Sweden's ambassador to the United States. After my book came out, and I'm not going to claim causality, he continued to have this remarkable career. He was elected president of the UN General Assembly, became the UN Special Envoy to Darfur, and became the Deputy Secretary General of the UN. And by the way, you wouldn't know this, but I just actually wrote a second book about him called The Education of a Statesman that was just published a couple weeks ago. And it actually deals with the last part of Eliasson's career, but also reflecting on the importance of diplomacy as we deal with these challenges. And his perspective is, when we're dealing with things, particularly like climate change and migration and refugees and human rights, these global alliances, this global cooperation, the rules-based order, which has been in place for more than 7 decades, is just critical for the the functioning of the global economy, and just sort of the preservation of security and commerce and so forth. So I just, as it happened, had a Zoom event with Eliason a week or so ago, and he's deeply, deeply concerned about what these next years may portend for the world. And interestingly, when I was talking to him right before the 2020 election, I said, well, so what do you think of the American election? And he said, I think it's the most important election in Sweden's history. Wow. And the point he was making is, the global implications of American elections are really profound. And, the message the Americans sent by bringing Donald Trump back to the White House is a stark one. I mean, as Jan says, what do you have to do to be disqualified for running for president and winning in the United States? You can be a convicted felon. You could lead an armed assault on the American government, and you still are elected by the American people. So I think, this election of Trump has raised profound concerns throughout the world about just what is going on in the United States and the ability of the United States public to make intelligent decisions that will affect not only the Americans, but the rest of the world.
This is such an important point, right? We tend to think American elections are only for America, but you're absolutely right. The rest of the world, and Europe in particular, is looking to the United States. And you see the diplomatic corps around the world, especially from NATO countries, expressing these concerns that the United States plays an important role in leading the world. And it's far from a perfect country, but that leadership is critical, especially as we're thinking about a shifting world where there's a rising China and complications in the Middle East. The U.S. role really is indispensable. And you get a sense of panic from many diplomats of what this next world order is going to look like if the United States pulls away from this role. I think you're onto something really, really important here.
Yeah, and I think, just maybe two issues quickly. One, Ukraine. The Europeans have absolutely no sense of what the Americans are going to do come, January 20th. Trump famously during the debate with Vice President Harris declined to say if he even wanted Ukraine to win the war or prevail or defend itself against Russia. He basically said we need to cut a deal and just kind of left it at that. So I think the Europeans are deeply, deeply concerned about what pressure Trump might place on Zelensky and what kind of tacit support he might give Putin. And the other issue, of course, is climate change. The Americans have been kind of late to the party, and we've moved incrementally, and we're making some change. But we now will have an administration in which the president is, deeply, deeply skeptical of any serious policy steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And is the best the world can hope for is 4 years of kind of stay the course, or is there going to be regression at a time when the climate crisis seems to be reaching a really critical point? Are we actually going to go backwards, and what is that going to portend for the future? So everything from Ukraine to the Middle East to climate change is really put into question when Donald Trump comes back to the White House in just a month or so.
These are such important conversations. And John, I so appreciate your time and helping me to think through some of these issues. We've been talking with John Shaw, who is the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thank you so much for joining us on WCPT. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I did too. Thank you so much, Bill. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, where's Hal Sparks? I'm not sure where he is now, but I know where you can find him Saturdays at 11. He'll be right here on WCPT 820 for the Hal Sparks radio program, Mega Worldwide. Because facts matter. You're listening to WCPT 820.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Billion Today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are now joined by one of my absolute favorite people, Dr. Phil Barker, who's a professor of political science and director of the honors program at Keene State College in Keene, New Hampshire. He teaches courses on international relations and comparative politics, and his research focuses on the role of religion in national identity and conflict. He also has the distinction of being my podcast partner on our weekly podcast called The Politics Lab. So welcome back to WCPT, Phil.
Thanks, Bill. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, so our thought for this hour is we're going to talk a lot about international politics and kind of think through the world that we're now operating with. So maybe we can start with a big picture look at how a second Trump presidential administration is likely to impact the world. So, Phil, what do you think Trump 2.0 will mean for the international system?
Bill, I've talked a lot about this. I think that this is a real turning point in global politics. So much of the way the international system works, the way global politics works, was set up in the post-World War II era, and it was largely a U.S.-led effort to kind of create structure and, organizations, the UN, NATO, and all these other things that brought some level of stability to the world after the World Wars. And that's kind of been the accepted standard of things for, close to a century at this point. And I feel like this is really kind of a major turning point in the sense that I think it's sort of clear to much of the world that the U.S. is not sort of willing to take on the kind of leadership role that they have in the past. We saw this with the first Trump administration and the world kind of trying to figure out what it looks like. If America is not sort of the front runner or the leader of international politics. But I think a lot of the world and I think a lot of Americans even saw that as kind of a blip. And I think the re-election of Trump sort of solidifies this new status where much of the world now has to figure out what does the world look like? How do we move forward if the United States is not kind of, the flag bearer of this kind of Western liberal international order?
This is such a really interesting point to grapple with, right? Because the United States has flaws, right? We are a flawed hegemonic power, a flawed global power, but we still play, this term an indispensable role in regulating that international system. And so now if the U.S. steps away, because Trump's not interested in leadership, right? He's interested in winning. So all of these relationships are now about, can Trump win against Canada? Can you win against, China, whatever it is? It means the rest of the world has to look for somebody else to fill that role. And as you think about a shifting balance of power, you see Europe now looking for somebody else, turning away, saying we're not sure the United States is going to be there. You've got China, the same thing. Like there really is a vacuum where we're not sure what's going to happen if the U.S. steps away from this role.
Yeah, and I think this is it's not just the U.S. stepping away either. It's the U.S. stepping away in such a dramatic manner. Like there were a lot of political scientists who wrote after the first Trump administration that there was a lot to critique amongst within the world of Trump's foreign policy, but there were some sort of kernels of truth in it, in the idea that the U.S. sort of was continuing to act like it was the sort of dominant power that it was in the 1950s, and it wasn't anymore. China had risen. We really needed to be relying more. We needed Europe to step up more. And so there was a lot of truth to all of that. But I think most political scientists who look at sort of, declining American power would say that the key is that the United States still needs to lead, but it needs to, bring other people along more, right? It needs to be sort of more an equal partner in this. And what the Trump view of America is really sort of just abandoning that leadership altogether. It's not that we're going to lead, but we're going to do it in a different kind of way. It's that we don't want anything to do with that. And that creates like this massive power vacuum, I think. And I think that's what's so disorienting for so much of the world.
And one could argue that it makes the U.S. job more difficult, right? So if you think about, we'll talk about China a little bit later, but if you're thinking about pushing back against China, these alliance structures, whether we're talking about, NATO or some of the alliances that we've built in Asia, those things matter. And and they're effective, right? I mean, the United States leading NATO is really important as we think about the war in Ukraine and allying ourselves with Japan and Australia, in Asia, in India. Those things help the United States accomplish the sort of foreign policy goals that they want to get to. And it's much more difficult if you decide you want to go do it on your own. I mean, it's sort of counterproductive in terms of achieving U.S. foreign policy initiatives.
That's a fascinating point. I mean, I think back to, that this was, again, also one of the critiques that came up with the Bush Doctrine, right? Which is where, the Bush administration also sort of stepped back from international leadership and international institutions, but they did it in a much more, kind of unilateral way. Like, we're just going to do what we want to do regardless. And there was lots of writing about how you have to realize that you need other countries to achieve your international goals. So in the Bush Doctrine, it was like, if you're gonna actually fight terrorism, you have to have intelligence sharing, and you have to have allies who are willing to work with you on that. And there was a bit of a short-sighted view of global politics then, and it feels like this is a very different type of sort of stepping back. Like, it's not that we're doing it on our own. It's that we don't want anything to do with it, which is kind of the Trump approach. But it's still, if Trump wants to achieve all of his ideas of, I don't know, tariffs and restructuring, containing China's economic power and all that, you have to have other countries. And so just sort of abandoning kind of leadership and institutions, again, feels short-sighted.
And I think, that's a really interesting point. And I think the world maybe allowed the United States one blip that was a Trump administration, right? But now if it happens again, I mean, and you see this in particular from European diplomats who say, the idea that you could have a one-off, like a weird Trump administration, but then the U.S. would return to the bipartisan consensus about global leadership and support of NATO, all of those things. But when you go back to Donald Trump, Europe now looks at the United States and says, this is the new norm, right? You're going to be wildly oscillating between very extreme forms of U.S. foreign policy. And even if the Democrats win the office again in 4 years, you can't be guaranteed that this isn't going to be a repetitive pattern. And so, I mean, you think about if you're Europe right now, if you're NATO, you're thinking about you do have to go it alone, or you have to go it as Europe, right? So, I mean, there's lots of speculation that Europe may think about developing its own fighting force, something separate from NATO. There's some Eastern European countries, Poland in particular, saying we need to take the lead on supporting Ukraine here, because you just can't count on the United States to play that role anymore. And again, this is not good for U.S. foreign policy.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, you're exactly right. The idea that, even if Donald Trump is not the new norm, right? If like isolationism is not, or, whatever, this America first approach is not the new norm of American foreign policy, the new norm is at least inconsistency. It is, you can't trust or you can't bank on anything in terms of the U.S. Like, you don't know what, there's no consistent sort of philosophy guiding U.S. foreign policy anymore. And so, if you're France or Britain or Ukraine or whoever, if you're Poland and you're worried about, an aggressive Russia, like that, anything that you're still going to hope that the U.S. is there for you, but you can't expect that. You can't rely on that. And that is, like, I think massively disorienting for so many people. This is where there's been, already a number of people talking about how European countries are already looking at and thinking about China differently, right? Because again, you and I have talked about on the podcast, like the international system likes stability. It likes consistency. And if the U.S. isn't going to provide that stability, countries are going to look elsewhere for that stability.
Even if they would prefer U.S. leadership. And I think that's one thing that stands out. I mean, there's a lot of countries around the world who would prefer the United States to, flaws and all, to continue that role as the global hegemon. But if they're not going to do it, then you have to reassess and say, okay, well, we'd prefer the United States to play these leadership roles on climate and other things and international security and poverty. But if they're not going to do that role, then we look to who's next in line. And again, China is very much excited about filling that gap. It makes me think of, so if you had to lay out what you anticipate coming out of the Trump administration, are you sort of predicting certain things? I mean, does Trump try to pull out of NATO? What are you looking for in terms of those first early weeks in the Trump administration on U.S. foreign policy?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that's been the most consistent in how his sort of new administration has talked is China and tariffs. I mean, it's really this sort of economic thing. It's really this trade war approach to stuff. And I don't know how exactly that will play out. I mean, economists and political scientists, not universally, but near universally talk about how that will be disastrous economically and all sorts of other things. But we'll see if that's actually the road he goes down. But, what will be interesting to see is how everyone else kind of responds to that. How does China respond to, this American approach? I do feel like it'll be interesting to see with NATO what will happen, because I do think you're right in that Trump likes to attack NATO, and it would be reasonable to assume that he would just kind of back away from, withdraw from NATO. But I also think a lot of other countries have learned how to handle Trump. And I think you'll see a lot of that, the kind of flattery that you would expect. And that might appease him to some extent. And also this is one of those weird things where, the sort of stepping back of American leadership, even though it is not what I think is best for the U.S. and what, international relations people would say is good, it might actually bring about some of the stuff that Trump has talked about. If the U.S. sort of abandons its role in NATO, it might actually lead to other NATO countries sort of stepping up, increasing their military commitments and whatnot. And so there's just so much that is unknown. I mean, I think this is where we're so used to this international system being what it is. And so if the Trump administration does in fact step back from NATO, it's unclear, I think, what will happen with the remaining NATO states. But yeah, I mean, that's the other thing with Trump is that he himself is so inconsistent, right? I mean, you look back to his first administration, and it began with, threatening fire and fury in North Korea, and then ending with sort of, love letters back and forth. Right, and so that's the part that I feel like America itself doesn't seem to have a consistent foreign policy. But I think Donald Trump doesn't either. I think Donald Trump's foreign policy is much like his other policies, which is like what's best for Donald Trump. Right. I think that changes from day to day in some ways.
And you're really, it's bringing up the flattery issue. It's sort of been stunning how, we saw this out of Canada today. Justin Trudeau was, flattering Donald Trump, and you're seeing this across the board. A lot of leaders are realizing that's how you approach it. And it's so apparent and transparent, but nonetheless, I mean, as we think about the lesson from North Korea, it works. So we got to jump to a quick break here, but when we come back, Phil, I want to pick your brain about Russia and all this nuclear saber rattling that's going on in Russia and whether we should be worried. So we'll be back in just a couple of minutes.
Driving it home with Patty Vasquez.
People get caught up in this argument about student loan forgiveness, and there are so many different examples of this, but if there's a better way to do it, and I get that you paid yours off and you played by the rules and it's not fair, there's so many things in life that are not fair. Why would you want the burden of this to continue to increase and negatively impact the future of young people?
Patty Vasquez, weeknights 5 to 7 on WCPT 820.
Hey Google, play WCPT.
Streaming Chicago's progressive talk from TuneIn.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are discussing international politics with Professor Phil Barker from Keene State College. Phil, let's turn to Russia and all of the nuclear saber rattling that's been coming out of Vladimir Putin. Should our listeners be worried about what's going on here? Maybe get us up to speed on what's happening there.
So I think the answer to should listeners be worried about Russia and nukes is always a little. I think you should always be a little worried about it. I think to some extent it's easy to forget, just like it's sort of easy to forget, how normal things used to be before sort of the chaos of Trump. But, the idea of nuclear saber rattling is really unheard of. I mean, the deterrence, nuclear deterrence, the threat of, the use of nuclear weapons was always sort of implicit, but it wasn't explicit the way that Vladimir Putin has made it. So in the last couple of weeks, as the Biden administration is coming to a close, the Biden administration has finally approved the use of essentially long-range missiles into Russia. So Ukraine has started launching attacks deep into Russia using American-made missiles. And I think unsurprisingly, Vladimir Putin's response has been to go to his sort of classic go-to card, which is to say, in fact, he released what they talked about as like a new nuclear doctrine, right?
Yeah.
Which was essentially that they basically, tell me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding of it, my impression was essentially that they reserve the right to use nukes to defend themselves, essentially. Not just in this case, it wouldn't just be against Ukraine, but against countries who are supplying or aiding Ukraine, an enemy of Russia, which is, an expansion.
It is an expansion. And the sort of little caveat to that is that they said if the power that is supplying Ukraine has nuclear weapons, it then allows Russia to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. So, obviously here both, the British and the United States are supplying Ukraine with missiles, not nuclear missiles, but because they are nuclear powers, therefore justifies Russia from using. Now, you spent a lot of time just looking at just war doctrine. Is this okay? Can you do that?
No. As you dig into like legal and ethical discussions, any first use or first strike of nuclear weapons is as sort of blatantly wrong as you can get in terms of morals and ethics and in terms of international law, even, right? And so, if he were to do this, it would be massive. Widely condemned from the international community. And I do think, like, when I look at his rhetoric, this is the other thing, even if you step back from, it certainly applies to nuclear weapons, but it applies beyond nuclear weapons as well, is that credibility is incredibly important. Like, it's super important when you're carrying out international relations. When you make a threat, you need people to believe it. And this is one of the things that Vladimir Putin has now gone to this well over and over and over again over the past several years. And I think it starts to ring hollow. Like, I don't really feel like a whole lot of people believe that he will actually resort to nuclear weapons. I think he sees a moment of turmoil, of uncertainty with the election in the United States, with it being sort of unclear what's the future of NATO. It's unclear what's the future of Western support for Ukraine. And I think he sees this opportunity to, try to push the buttons a little bit, push people a little further, try to drive some wedges into that Western alliance. But it doesn't feel, I would be shocked if anything came of it. What do you think about that?
Yeah,
do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's my read as well. This feels like he's bluffing, and because there would be no reason for him to, raise the stakes in that way, right? He's got Donald Trump coming into office, and I think if you're Vladimir Putin, you're excited about a Trump presidency because it's likely going to help you if Trump does indeed follow through of sort of limiting some of that support of Ukraine. So, and Russia has made some incremental advancements in Ukraine at a great cost, right? The casualty figures for Russia going into Ukraine are just unbelievable, but it does feel he's in a better position now than he was a few months ago. So yeah, it does feel like he's bluffing here. He's not going to actually use a nuclear weapon. But again, as you noted, there still is some concern in that. And it was funny. I did a TV interview last week where I basically said that. I said, this feels like he's bluffing. And they posted that online, and the YouTube video got like thousands of comments from, Russian bots and trolls who were clearly attacking me for daring to suggest that Vladimir Putin may be, bluffing that he's going to use a nuclear weapon, right? So there's still lots of concern out there that he is a dangerous character. And I do think he is, right? He's not fully stable in the way that you want a nuclear power to be stable.
Now, do you think that this was the right decision by the Biden administration to allow this? And then also, do you think they should have done it sooner? Part of this is part of what I go through in my head, which is it that this is really a bluff now, and it's a bluff because of the sort of slow, methodical pace at which the Biden administration has sort of supported and limited Ukraine. Like if the Biden administration had gone straight to allowing Ukraine to launch attacks deep into Russia, would this be a more valid bluff? Like, does that make sense? Like, how do you feel about the timing of how the Biden administration has done this?
The timing is really important. And I think what we see out of the Biden administration is somebody who's deeply worried about escalation, right? I mean, they have been so careful, so cautious, and to many, so slow, right? Including the Ukrainians who said, hey, if you were going to get here and let us use these ballistic missiles that we can launch 190 miles, like, why didn't you get here quicker? I tend to give Biden some grace here because I think it's dangerous. And as we both know, the history is full of wars that escalated because nobody thought it was going to escalate, right? And so I think it's important to be cautious here. And I think it's the fact that Biden is doing this is more a reflection of the conditions on the ground where it feels like things are not going well for Ukraine. So give them whatever they can do to slow this down. I mean, because, Biden in the last couple of weeks has said, here, you can have these ballistic missiles that you can launch into. Actually, they've had the missiles. Now they can launch them into Russia. And you can use landmines, which, again, also ethically really, really complicated. But I think Biden is doing so because he feels like if he doesn't do more, it's possible that Ukraine could lose this war. And with these actions, maybe they can not win it, but avoid loss, right? And again, that's what I think is motivating him. What's your read on the timing of all this?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was right to be cautious in sort of allowing Ukraine to go further with these weapons. I think I tend to think that the Biden administration could have moved quicker. I think they could have. If it's acceptable now, it probably should have been acceptable 6 months ago.
Sure.
And I think that, this is, it feels like, well, it's only because you've lost that the Biden has lost the election that he's now sort of taking these steps. And that feels problematic for me in terms of motivation, in the sense of if it's okay to do this, if it's not too much of a risk, then we should have allowed it to happen sooner, and maybe the war would have taken a slightly different direction. Now, I do think that if we had been sort of overly aggressive from the beginning, you might have this could have spilled over into a bigger conflict quicker. And so, this is the beauty of what you and I do. We can sit back and sort of look at it and critique it and not have to make the actual hard decisions. It's the same thing with the landmines. You and I haven't had a chance to talk about that, but how do you make sense of the morality or the ethics of that? Because strategically, it's brilliant. They don't go away, even if Trump's in office. If Ukraine puts down landmines, then even when Trump comes along, they still benefit from those landmines. But they also stay, for years, decades. They're completely indiscriminate in who they kill. And so I don't know. I really wrestle. I mean, landmines are pretty clearly an unethical thing, but they're strategically really valuable.
Phil, this is a perfect radio tease. We got to go to break, and we will come back and we'll talk more about landmines and the ethics of landmines, and we can kind of walk through those positions because this is a really, really important question. We will be right back on WCPT.
This is Chicago's Progressive Talk, 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and online at WCPT820.com, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll. Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are discussing international politics with Professor of Political Science Philip Barker. And when we went to break, we were discussing the use of landmines, and in particular, the ethical concerns of the United States providing them to Ukraine against Russia. And I will say, Phil, I feel rather uncomfortable with them. There's a global treaty outlawing the use of landmines. Now, the United States is not a member of this treaty, but these, as you noted before the break, they stick around for years and years and years. The casualty rate among civilians is very, very high. The United States has argued that they're using sort of smart landmines that don't last that long, but I feel like this is one of those really difficult ethical positions where Ukraine losing the war is not a good thing, but using landmines at the same time is also a very, very problematic action. What's your read on this too?
No, I agree. I mean, it's easy. And I think this is the challenge, or this is the difficult thing. It's easy to feel like, well, we have to win this war. That, Russia defeating Ukraine is a bad outcome. We have to do what we must in order to win. But that's the logic or the motivation that always takes us to terrible places. And so, when you get into, discussing morality and ethics in war and other areas, it's, the idea is things that are wrong are wrong. And to decide that, hey, winning this war would be difficult if we don't do this is not a good enough justification. So yes, I think that, the thing that is particularly problematic about landmines is that they are indiscriminate, right? Whoever comes along and steps on them is killed. And the whole point of ethics in war is that you should not be targeting non-civilians. You have to do whatever you can to make sure that only soldiers are the ones being targeted. So yeah, as much as I recognize the good that they will do in helping Ukraine, I still can't come around to feeling like it's the right thing to do, because I think at the core of it, they're deeply problematic. Well,
and the argument that the United States has put forward in partial justification for this is, well, Russia is already using them, and it feels a little bit like, well, they started it. And I understand that dynamic to say Russia has just littered the landscape with landmines to make it more difficult for Ukraine to advance. You can't deny Ukraine that same opportunity, but that's the point here. If you're going to have rules and ethics and try to protect civilians in wartime, you have to do this. And so this is messy, and I think it's putting the United States in a compromised moral position if we're using these. And again, I don't know the science on all of them, and I'm not so sure that these landmines are smart. I don't think any landmines are particularly smart. But this actually is a good transition. We also wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on in Israel. And on November 21st, the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as his defense minister, this guy Gallant, over what it says may constitute, legal responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated by Israel during its war on Gaza. Can you maybe kind of talk us through what's happening here and what the court is doing?
Yeah, so I mean, the International Criminal Court is I don't know how familiar people are with it. You are more of an expert than I am, Bill. But yeah, I mean, this has been an institution that's been around for 25 years at this point ish. Yeah, I mean, the whole idea was after just a little background, right after World War II, it became clear that there was no real process, no real institution available for actually prosecuting the war criminals coming out of Nazi Germany, because what they did was legal under German law, right? And so it was clear that there needed to be international laws that banned certain things, and that was kind of let go until the 90s when we had genocides in Rwanda and Yugoslavia. And so there was this big push to form this court. And the whole idea behind it is that there are these fundamental rules, fundamental things that are illegal no matter who does them, and they are illegal essentially no matter where you do them. And so those things are war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. And so what has happened in Israel is that the court itself, prosecutors began looking into the actions of not just Israel in Gaza, but the actions of Hamas that sparked this whole war. And so they sought arrest warrants for the 2 Israeli leaders, but also for 3 leaders of Hamas for violating the fundamental laws of war. And they issued 2 arrest warrants for Israeli leaders, 1 arrest warrant for a Hamas leader. They only issued 1 because Israel has already killed the other 2 that the ICC was investigating. So this is, the U.S. has been sort of opposed to the ICC for a really long time. But you and I have talked a lot about this. Certainly, legal power can be abused, and it's reasonable for people to be worried about, how could this be used in problematic ways. But at the heart of it, the ICC hasn't shown any of those. There are all sorts of checks on the ICC, limits on what it can do. And so for them to come out and say that we not only do we believe this has been happening, we think it's clear enough that we're going to issue an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu is really dramatic and powerful. And I think it does a lot to, impact the narrative. I mean, I think the narrative has already been impacted, but I think this is, an arrest warrant has real implications for a leader and for how they can go about carrying out foreign policy. I think it really does cast a dark shadow over this moment in Israeli foreign policy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's difficult, right? Because you have in the United States, both Democrats and Republicans have criticized the International Criminal Court. Joe Biden came out and the administration criticized these arrest warrants and said they're non-productive. But I think if you step back and say international justice is going to matter, then you have to empower these institutions to do this. And again, if you step away from one's personal perspective, either pro or anti-Israel, whatever those positions are, and you just look at the evidence, the ICC is very, very deliberate. And they don't do this if it's just one incident, right? They're looking for policies and plans where these are occurring on a much larger scale. And part of the indictment that the level against Israel is that, they're using starvation as a weapon of war. And that's, very clearly outlawed. And again, it gets us into really some uncomfortable political dynamics. But in terms of the court's operation itself, it does feel like they've backed the case up. And also, as you noted, also have gone after Hamas leaders for similar war crimes and crimes against humanity. But to the latter point that you made about Benjamin Netanyahu, when the court puts these arrest warrants out, if Netanyahu travels to a member state, a member of the International Criminal Court, they are now treaty bound to bring him to The Hague, right? And so a number of like Canada said that they would exercise the warrant. And I'm trying to remember France, Italy, I think, said they also would. And some other European states have said they're not so sure about this. But this will, at a minimum, impact Netanyahu's travel around the world because he has to think about this arrest warrant is out there and that he certainly could end up facing charges in The Hague at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, just to kind of follow up on what you were saying, that it is important to recognize, I think the legal language on many of the crimes that the ICC is looking at is that they have to be like systematic or widespread, right? So these are not just little issues, right? You have to show, these are not incidents, right? This is a widespread policy. And that's why they are looking at the political leaders, right? Who are the sort of authors of those policies. That's who they're going after. And so, I mean, it's telling that the United States was celebrating the arrest warrant that the ICC issued when it was against Vladimir Putin a couple of years ago, right? And now are lambasting it when it's against Israel. And I think if there is something central to that, if you can point to why it is legitimate in one situation and not in the other, then great. But it really does feel like it's not something to do with the details of the charges. This has to do with, one of these people is our ally and one is our enemy. And so we're reacting differently to it. And that inconsistency is part of what leaves much of the world frustrated with American leadership.
Right. The law should be the law. Well, let's maybe step back from the ICC perspective a little bit and think about what's transpiring on the ground in the Middle East right now. So we have a tentative ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah, but nothing close to a ceasefire or any kind of agreement in Gaza. What's your read about what we're seeing there in terms of some of these dynamics, whether it's Israel and Iran, or what are you seeing as we kind of watch this all play out?
It's interesting. I mean, again, I think there's so many pieces at play here that we'll kind of see. But I mean, at first glance, I look at what's happening right now in the Middle East, and I think this is not, if you are supportive of, if you were a supporter of Hamas, you would be really concerned about this. Mm-hmm. I think that Hamas was going to find itself increasingly isolated, right? As Hezbollah is sort of pulling back now. I think that the coming Trump administration, I think the world expects, and probably appropriately so, for the, whatever kind of restraints the Biden administration has been trying to put on Netanyahu and Israel. I don't know that restraints is the right word, but, they've been trying to sort of calm things down or, whatever. And I feel like that's going to go, right? Most people expect that when Trump comes into office, he's going to empower Netanyahu to essentially do whatever he needs to do. And so I think that one of the things, I think it seems like Iran believes towards that as well. It seems like Iran is trying to kind of tread more carefully coming into this new era as well. So I mean, all of that could mean, that things sort of simmer down a little bit. But I think it also could mean that this is, an unchecked Israel who is less afraid of Iran and is has the opportunity. There's already been talk within the Israeli administration about annexing the West Bank and stuff like that. I think the part that is bad for Israel is that I don't know what the end outcome of all this is.
Yeah.
So like, even if they were to annex the, Gaza or the West Bank, like how are you going to do that? How are you going to govern? That's the part that feels sort of short-sighted for me, in terms of Israeli policy right now. And I don't know what the solution or what the outcome is for them.
I think that's a great point, because Israel has clearly established itself as the dominant military power in the region. I mean, Iran now realizes that, Hezbollah now realizes that, and I don't know if that was always established beforehand, right? I mean, Israel was a significant military player, but the distance between Israel and Iran is so stark now. And so what you're seeing is, I think you're right, Iran is pulling back, Hezbollah is also pulling back, and they had pledged that they were going to continue this fight until there was an agreement with Hamas, and that's no longer the case, right? So sort of, they're, like you said, they're leaving them alone. But at the end of the day, we still have no long-term political solution for Gaza, right? And I think that's a problem for Israel. They can be a dominant military power, but until you have some sort of political solution, that's not going to end the situation, right? You have to have some sort of meaningful political self-determination for Gaza. Otherwise, Israel is going to continue to have a military operation. And as we know from history, that just doesn't work out well. So I think we're seeing military progress, but not necessarily political progress. And behind the scenes, I have no doubt that Joe Biden, who believes in diplomacy and believes in multilateralism, is doing everything the administration can, but they just haven't been able to push Israel or Hamas in a much more political direction. So, we got to go to one more break. When we come back, I want to talk to Phil about China and what we're seeing in Asia, and specifically thinking about the rise of China and how a Trump administration may respond to that. So we will be back in just a couple minutes.
WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are discussing international politics with Professor of Political Science Phil Barker from Keene State College. And Phil, I want us to transition to China and think about specifically, China's rise and emergence as a global power, and Donald Trump's, impending second presidency. What do you think about as we kind of think about this balance between a Trump administration and China? What's going through your head as we sort of contemplate that reality?
I think this is, back to sort of what we were talking about when we first started. I don't quite know what to expect here. I mean, and that's partly because I think you have two, in some ways, it's weird to think of this, but I think you have both in the U.S. and in China, two sort of strong personalities leading both of these countries, right? With Trump comes into power and with Xi in China. And on one hand, I think that China is probably anxious about the economic instability or turbulence that could be caused under a Trump administration with tariffs and trade wars and all of that. On the other hand, I think China must be pretty thrilled in some ways. Going back to what we talked about earlier, if the U.S. is going to sort of abdicate its leadership role, I think that's what China has been pushing for a really long time. China has wanted to be at least an equal, if not the sort of hegemon when it comes to international politics. They push back on a lot of this kind of Western liberal order of human rights and institutions and the kind of traditional view of sovereignty, and China has wanted to change a lot of those ideas, norms, concepts. And so the less the U.S. is willing to fight them on that front, the more sort of elbow room and leeway they have to actually achieve some of their goals. And in particular, if much of the rest of the world who has looked to the U.S. in the past for leadership is now looking elsewhere, that becomes a real opportunity for China to sort of expand its influence. So I see a real opportunity here. It really could go anytime you introduce sort of instability or unexpected expected dynamics into a sort of great power dynamic, a situation like this, there's all sorts of room for mistakes and errors and misconceptions and whatnot to come into play. That part makes me really nervous. But the other thing is that both countries have a lot on the line, sort of financially and economically. I don't see Trump as one that necessarily gets that. But what do you think? What are you expecting to see over the next 4 years with U.S.-China relations?
Well, I really like the way you described China trying to rewrite the rules of the international system. And that's been going on for a long time. Yeah. But up until a second Trump administration, there has always been the U.S. pushback against that. And now the question is, will Trump be indifferent to that, right? So does Trump say, I don't care about the global international order. I more care about the grifts and I want to get mine. And right, if China wants to do their thing, let them do their thing as long as I can advance. And right, that may create the space for China to begin to dismantle this international system and create a system that is more reflective of its interests. So that's sort of interesting as you think about that. The other thing that I was thinking about is how you approach China, right? So in the previous segment, you were talking about North Korea and how Trump oscillated between threatening to totally destroy North Korea to then falling in love with Kim Jong-un. I don't think you can do that with China. There's a level of respect and stability that you have to speak to China with. The optics matter. And so Trump will have to be careful, because if he is going to try to be the bully, I don't think that works with China. And it could lead to the sort of situation you describe where suddenly things escalate quite quickly. And for me, I really think about what's going to happen with Taiwan. Joe Biden had said that the United States will do whatever is necessary to defend Taiwan, even including, a military support, maybe boots on the ground, like all of that. How will Donald Trump feel about that? I think it's unlikely Donald Trump could find Taiwan on a map, right? If he can't find Taiwan, is he going to care about defending that? And that has real implications. We don't want to get too far in the weeds, but, microchips, the chip war, all of that is central to Taiwan maintaining its independence. And so these are real questions that require complex solutions to them. And I'm just not sure Trump is ready to play that game.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think the other part that's the other factor that is concerning for me as I look at it is that sort of contentious kind of bullying approach that Trump might take. I don't know that will be effective. And it is happening at a time where the DC consensus has sort of, kind of amassed around this sort of hawkish view of China. So there is this tendency on both Republicans and Democratic, both sides of the aisle, to sort of look at China with this, they're the new enemy, right? They're the new, the new big evil in the world. And so, my fear is if Trump takes this approach and, China sees this as an opportunity to move on Taiwan or whatever, I don't know that Trump will react necessarily super strongly, but I feel like the DC establishment might, right? And so that is where you get, I don't know that there's a whole lot of, voices in the room and the big room of Washington, DC, who are going to push back against Trump if he gets increasingly sort of bellicose or aggressive with China. And I think back to, it really feels like a time where there needs to be that kind of dispassionate view of things. You and I had a conversation with Roland Paris, who was one of our professors in grad school, who was an advisor to Trudeau in Canada a number of years ago, about how does the world view China and the U.S. And he talked a lot about the need to sort of recognize that China is a world power and has a right to be at the table and to make some of these demands. But it's also really important to push back on the things that really matter, like human rights and whatnot. And so I worry that, we're not, stepping back, allowing China a little bit more role might be the right answer. But again, it feels like under the Trump administration, it's more this sort of abdication on issues of human rights and morality. Right. And it's just all about the dollars in the end. And that's, I think, is problematic.
You need a sophisticated approach to China, which can acknowledge their rise, but also be thoughtful in how you engage them. Well, your analysis there, Phil, got one of our texters who chimed in and said China is thrilled with Trump. Trump is weak. Trump won't support Taiwan. Trump could be bribed, brought, or scared by China. So I think that's sort of I think there's some truth to that. The other really important element to all of this is that Trump is entering he's becoming president for the second time in a much more dangerous world. You and I have talked about this. When he first came into office, the world was relatively stable, and certainly there were challenges. North Korea was a challenge. But right now, when you think about, you have a war in Europe, you have a destabilized Middle East, you have a rising China. This global environment is much more taxing and much more complicated than the world that he entered in 2016. So that makes the job more difficult, and I'm not so sure he's in any better position to manage that chaos.
That's a very kind way to say that. Yes. No, I think, yes, he's certainly not in any better. I mean, because in the sense of, he's whatever, it's an additional 5 years down the road. And before Trump had surrounded himself with, as much as you and I might disagree with them, with oftentimes really smart people, right? Generals. Yeah. And it doesn't feel he's being intentional about taking a very different approach with who he surrounds himself with this time. And yes, you're right. The other thing is there, a war in Europe, a war in the Middle East, tensions in Asia. And, as you and I have talked about, connections between all of those, right? So you now have North Korea and Russia have signed this defense treaty. China has long had connections to North Korea. Iran has Iran is providing drones to Russia. There are all these economic and military connections between these powers who are set on altering the international system. And it really does feel like a pivotal moment that Trump is coming into. And he's coming into it, I think, with this, a broad approach of being largely sort of not caring, right? I think it's, again, Trump, you have to look at what's in Trump's interest and not what's in the U.S. interest to understand kind of what will come out of U.S. foreign policy.
And that's not a good place to be, right? I mean, you ideally, that's the thing. When you think about, Republican versus Democratic administrations, there's always been at least some sort of philosophical approach that drives that approach to the international system. And in general, it has been the United States should play a prominent role. And Trump is both pulling away from that role, but not redefining what it means. And that, again, that's significant. So, well, we need to wrap up. But thank you, Phil. There's so much going on domestically, in the United States right now. It's easy to lose focus on that. There's also a lot of really important stuff going on in the world itself. So we appreciate your insight again. We've been talking with Dr. Phil Barker, who's a professor of political science at Keene State College. Thanks so much, Phil. I always enjoy our conversations.
Me too, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, and as we wrap up, let me offer a quick note of gratitude for the opportunity to be here 3 hours and talk politics with all of you. Actually, I was here twice this week, and I can't tell you how much fun it has been. I'm grateful for Joan. I'm grateful to Lady B for this opportunity. Again, I very much appreciate having this space, and I think this space is really important for our democracy and our political discourse. So, again, special thanks to Lady B for all her help in making everything go smoothly. I look forward to being back with you all again at some point in the future. Thank you so much, and have a nice weekend.